Do you believe that the agricultural potential of Transkei is not only massive, but it's being wasted? Is this a myth or is it reality? Let's have a look in this session of Mike's Eastern Cape, the Transkei agriculture myth. Let's look at it in the context of land and law and people. You hear this story or myth in a number of different forms. This enormous agricultural potential is just being wasted. It could be the breadbasket of South Africa, which appeals to the politicians. Why won't they sell their cattle? There are too many cattle causing too many dongas. They could be commercial farmers, not just subsistence farmers. And anyway, look at all that empty land being wasted. We need to look at the physical factors in terms of the agricultural potential itself as one half of this, and the other half, why is it being wasted, if it is being wasted? So let's have a look at the physical side first. If you assess an area for its agricultural potential, there are four main factors. First of all, is there enough rainfall or water? If there isn't any, then you're in the middle of the Sahara. Are the temperatures reasonable for growing crops, somewhere between 10 and 30 degrees Celsius? Do they have adequate soils? Are the soils deep enough? Are they reasonable texture? Do they hold moisture? Do they erode easily? And the slope. You can only farm with crops up to a certain slope. Reasonably, with mechanical farming or animal draft farming, you can only go up to about 12%, maybe 15%, but then you're really pushing it. So let's have a look first at the rainfall. In the Eastern Cape, up in the northeast, the Transkei portion of it, we've got 1,000 millimeters or more along the coast. Summer rainfall. By the middle of the province, we've only got 500 millimeters, and that 500 millimeter ISA height is a very significant borderline, because on one side of it, you can grow crops. On the other side of it, to the west, the rainfall isn't adequate to support crops. And we can get as little as 200 millimeters all year rainfall or anytime rainfall in practice. And that makes an enormous difference. On the east, you can grow crops, you can keep livestock and feed them. But on the west, you're restricted to small stock, goats, sheep, wildlife, and if you're fortunate, irrigation. But even where we've got good rainfall, it's not all perfect. You're likely to get hail 1 or 2 times in a season, particularly November, December. You may well get mid-season droughts, which many people don't take account of, but which are crucial in terms of the development of your crops and the eventual yield. And people are more aware of the fact that in our part of the world, drought every now and again is normal. It's not extraordinary, it's normal. So if we have a look in detail, the number of dry spells of 14 days, 2 weeks, which is what really affects your crops. 60-year records for Mount Fletcher. And you can see that in November, 1 year in 3, you're not going to get any planting rains. In the season as a whole, you're going to get 44 dry spells in 60 years. So in other words, most years you're going to have a dry spell during the cropping season. Compare that with Port St. John's in the column next door to it, where you get virtually no dry spells because it's in that good coastal rainfall belt. So if we look then at the soils, our soils in this part of the world are very closely related to the original geology. And on this map here in gray, you can see the Beaufort system soils, 230 million years old. very erodible, shallow, poor soils with virtually no fertility, really a problem if they're mistreated. In purple, the little purple patches scattered around are the dolerite soils. These are volcanic, relatively fertile, relatively deep, the typical red soils that are easily seen from a distance. In the lower courses of the big rivers, we get another useful group of soils, the alluvium, deposited by the rivers, usually in the forms of little flat river terraces, but very limited in area compared with the whole of the Eastern Cape. Down in the southwest of Transkei, we get another group of problem soils, the duplex soils, which again are very ancient, but they consist of two layers, as the name implies, duplex. There's a thin layer of topsoil, which is often quite sandy or light, and underneath it, immediately underneath it, is a solid layer of clay. So water can't penetrate it, and you've got a really serious problem, and it needs very, very special management if you're going to be using it for cropping. So even up in Bazana there, if you look at that area, where we were showing you a moment ago, we've got high rainfall. Down in the coastal area, we've got high rainfall, but you've got very poor soils. So all you've got is Ngongoni felt. If we look at those soils in the landscape, here you can easily see the red dolerite soils. But if you look carefully, not very far away, the pale gray of the Beauforts. In another example here in the foreground, you can see the dolerite soils eroded in this case along a stock path. But the Beaufort soils in the background there, widespread, gray, pale, and not anything like as fertile, and easily abused. If you look at this photograph here, look at the very, very thin layer of topsoil on the top, and underneath it, this horrible, erodible subsoil. And if you look carefully close to the skyline, you'll see two little white dots, which are actually road culverts. And it's the road culverts there that are the cause of this erosion. On this hillside near Butterworth, you can see a whole hillside here eroded with severe donga erosion. Why? Because it was plowed, and it should never have been plowed. People talk about overgrazing and erosion. Yes, true, but not so much by cattle. The more important grazers are merino sheep because of the way they graze and they tug right down to the root systems. Then the roads and the railways provide culverts like this that are just as damaging. If we look at the landscape as a whole, this is what would easily be called wasted land, empty land. Why is nothing being done with it? Nothing is happening on it. Well, look at the donga erosion. Look at the stream bed erosion right down onto the bedrock, and particularly look at the topsoil erosion, the sheet erosion, that thin layer of precious, precious topsoil, which is only a few centimeters deep. And when that is gone, as here, over virtually the whole landscape here, then there is virtually nothing you can do with it. Even when left to go back under natural felt, it's going to provide very, very poor grass cover. So is it wasted and empty? Or has the topsoil all gone? If we look at the province as a whole, the erosion picture is pretty grim. And it coincides almost entirely with the distribution of the Beaufort soils. And it's no respecter of whether it's commercial farmland in the west there, where the worst erosion in the province is, or on communal land, where the whole of Transkei, where it's rampant. If we look at the temperature story, it's a little more optimistic. We can identify optimal crops, groups of crops that are suited by temperature together in particular circumstances. If we look at the winter temperatures, the length of the frost season, is it frost-free? How many cold units does it get? What's the day length? And the aspect, the slope. If you're on a north-facing slope, for example, even if the temperatures are relatively low, you've still got a warm slope compared with the southwesterly slopes facing the southwesterly rainfall. If we look at Bazana up in the north in the optimal area for rainfall, and we look at it in terms of temperature, you can see that from the coast to the uplands, inland, there's a complete difference. You can grow apples at the top end, and down at the coast, you could grow bananas if you had reasonable soils. But when we look at slope or topography, we start to see some real serious limitations. Here alongside the Umzimvubu River, you can see that arable land. It's a flat river terrace, very fertile. It's actually been cropped for nearly 2,000 years. And up on the top land, we've got reasonable slope as well. Anything below about 12% slope is okay for cropping. And if we look at this area near Willowvale, then the same story is there. Again, there's limited, some top land there. But on that top land, on reasonable slopes, we also need houses and roads. So there are severe limitations in terms of slope. If we put all this package together and we look at what we call land capability, which is a blending of all these factors together, and we look here at Mbashi, local municipality, around Dutchwa and Willowvale and down to the coast, then we see, in fact, because the arable here is represented in green, is arable class 3, class 4 soils. They're not perfect, but they're reasonable. They're very limited compared to the landscape as a whole. And we see the same thing even if we look at the wild coast from end to end. Very limited, good arable land in reasonable areas. If we look specifically here at Elandini municipality, the area around Maclear, Yugi, Mount Fletcher, in green and yellow, we've got the maize potential areas. And if we take the theory, in theory, with this rainfall, we could get 8 tons a hectare. But the soil water holding capacity is a bit limited, so it brings it down to a potential of about 7. Because it's at altitude and it's cooler and the growing season is shorter, it limits to about 6 tons a hectare. And every now and again, we get growing season dry spells, even up there. And that brings it down on average over a few seasons to about 5 tons a hectare of potential. And finally, you have to add in to the physical factors, you have to add in the human factor of management, and that can make an enormous difference to the potential yield as well. So, the Transkei agriculture myth? Yes, there is agricultural potential without a doubt. But it has limitations, particularly of slope and the soils, the roadable soils, whether they are really cultivatable, how fertile they are, how well they hold water. And they are randomly distributed. There are very, very few big blocks of land which are suitable for mechanical cropping. So what about the social, the human environment? Household economics, roads, food security, markets, government programs. And we'll have a look at those next time because there isn't time here. So in the next session, the Transkei agriculture myth, looking at that social environment in relation to the potential. Thank you for watching. See you next time.